When I first introduced aggregate supply, I only introduced the short-run model, and I said that there's a lot of agreement. People don't argue too much back and forth about it. However, there's a lot of argument about kind of the larger picture of aggregate supply. I don't want to say the short run versus the long run, because one of these two competing schools of thought doesn't really recognize the idea of a short run, long run distinction. We'll get more into that later on. So the two competing schools of thought, and there are others, but these are kind of the biggest two, and most of the other schools of thought, for example, the Austrian school of thought is pretty popular. It's not entirely dissimilar from what we're going to talk about here. So the point is there are other ones out there, but they kind of still go onto these two sides. So we're going to talk about the Neoclassical or Monetarist school of thought. Let's talk about this name for just a second. Neoclassical, it means new classical, and it's basically a revival of the ideas that govern the economy previous to the Keynesian view. It's actually the way I've set it up here. I have a reason for it, but chronologically, it was classical economics. Keynesian economics responded to the problems that classical economics failed to deal with, and then neoclassical or monetarist kind of grew out of some dissatisfaction with Keynesian policies. However, of course, as you can see, there's neo-Keynesian and new Keynesian. Those are kind of some subsets of it. They're not entirely different. I think mostly just people want to have a different name. Anyway, so the neoclassical or monetarist school of thought, its major principle is this idea of self-regulation. And the reason that it's neoclassical is that was the major idea of classical economics. Classical economics, Adam Smith, a French guy named Jean-Baptiste Say, these guys that kind of put forth economic thought in the late 1700s and 1800s, they really said that the government should practice a hands-off, especially Say. He put forth this idea of laissez-faire, which is a hands-off policy to the economy, meaning the government shouldn't mess with it, they're only going to make things worse. So that is really at the heart of this way of thinking, that government intervention is only going to make the economy worse off, therefore the market, so demand and supply, etc., the role of the market is really emphasized. Let the market work, let the price mechanism, etc. work, and it'll fix the problems that the economy is having. Okay? And again, that's that idea of self-regulation. When people talk or when they describe themselves as an economic conservative, they typically mean they favor more of these ideas. They really came forth, Milton Friedman in the 70s really kind of pushed them forward, and they were adopted most actively by Reagan and Thatcher. They're probably most well known for it, though of course there are other politicians who have also practiced these ideas. And again, I think to be fair, in the modern day, you know, most politicians may pick and choose from the various sides, seeing as how, you know, the way they see fit. Okay, the Keynesian side of things, let's actually start down here. When Keynes was writing his theories, Keynes was around in the 1930s, and he was basically writing in reaction to the Great Depression. The Great Depression, of course, started in the United States and really spread throughout the whole world, and really all of industrial society, all of Western Europe, and other parts of the world as well, were greatly affected by the Great Depression. So Keynes has a famous quote. His famous quote is, in the long run, we're all dead. What he means by that is, it's not that he didn't believe in the self-regulation that the classical economists were saying would work. He was just saying that to wait around for the self-regulation to happen would be too long. A lot of that has to do with the complexity and size of the economy. It's easy to say that an economy will self-regulate when the economy is rather small. But when the economy is quite big, it's going to take a very long time for that self-regulation or balance or equilibrium to occur. I always make the example of if I have like just a glass of water, And if I were to drop a rock or hit the side of the glass of water, you'd see some ripples, but the glass of water would go back to being, still within, a matter of minutes at the most, maybe even within a minute. Whereas if you had a bigger body of water, a swimming pool or something like that, and you gave it a shake, it's going to take a much longer time for that disturbance to settle down and go back to being still. So that's kind of what we see with the size of the economy. If an economy is small, like economies were in the 1700s and 1800s, well, disturbances in that, they'll get fixed pretty quickly. But in a large, modern-day, very complex economy, it's going to take a much longer time. So a major point of the Keynesians is this idea of sticky wages and prices. If you think about it, it's really easy to make wages go up. But to bring wages back down is very difficult. If you tell me that my wage is going to double, and then the next day you say, just kidding, I'm bringing it back down to where it was, I'm going to fight that. But obviously, I would have very easily accepted my wage going higher. Likewise with prices. It's very easy from a supplier point of view, it's very easy to raise the price of my prices. That's great. That's just like my wage going up. But for me as a seller to lower my prices can be quite difficult. I maybe don't want to do that. We'll talk more about it later. Okay? Therefore, because the self-regulation isn't going to occur, the role of the government is emphasized. Keynes emphasized that, hey, somebody's got to step in and do it, so the government should do it. Okay? When people talk about being an economic liberal or even an economic moderate, they probably believe more in these kind of ideas over here. I don't have any people listed because, to be quite honest, Keynes obviously, but most politicians seem to fall into this camp in one way or another. You don't see as many politicians over here because, well, basically the politician is saying the best thing I can do is do nothing, and people don't seem to like that. When we try to model these two competing schools of thought, you can see the models that you would choose look quite different, though they're both trying to depict the exact same thing. They're both trying to depict a more realistic view of aggregate supply than just the idea of short-run aggregate supply. In the Neoclassical view, the major distinction that you see is there's two curves here, and both of them are aggregate supply. So neoclassical economics emphasizes the distinction between short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. They say, well, it's one way in the short run, but in the long run, it's actually a little bit different. You see here that long run is equal to national income at the full employment level. If you don't remember what full employment is, you need to go back to the last video. Which is basically the same idea of long-run potential, meaning we can't go beyond that for very long, maybe for a short amount of time, but eventually we're going to come back to our long-run potential. This is my metaphor of the marathon runner. And again, that's for the most part the same idea as the PPC, or the Production Possibilities Frontier. The major difference is that equilibrium can exist in both the short run, can exist in the short run, but not in the long run, or they can exist at the same place, which is what we really want. So let me give you a quick example of this, although we'll do more of this later on. Let's go ahead and draw an aggregate demand right here. And if that's aggregate demand, what we're saying is at price level 1, you have equilibrium between demand and supply. But if you look at it more with a more nuanced view, you could say, well, at price level 1, we don't actually have equilibrium because demand is here and supply is there. So it's that recognition that supply exists in two different ways, the short run and the long run, that would cause the self-regulation. So because, for example, at price level 1, if we ignore short run aggregate supply, we would say at price level 1, aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply. Therefore, we have a surplus. We're producing more GDP than what aggregate demand is actually calling for. So that would be the power, and we'll talk more about how they see this working. That would be the reason or the cause for the self-regulation. So when we talk about the self-regulation, it's because of this difference in equilibrium between short run and long run. Now note, if the aggregate demand curve existed right here, then none of that power, none of that cause that I just mentioned would exist. We would say at price level 1, the short run aggregate supply equilibrium is right there. And equilibrium in the long run between aggregate demand and aggregate supply is in the same spot. So in that case, the economy would be very balanced, and that's kind of the holy grail, what everybody is trying to get to happen. The Keynesian view, you can see, is quite different. First of all, again, as we said, there's only the aggregate supply curve. If you want, you can call this Keynesian aggregate supply, but it would really be wrong to label it long run aggregate supply. And many students do that, and there's really no reason to. It kind of shows that you don't quite understand the theory. The important part of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve is A, B, and C, these three different sections of the aggregate supply curve. Let's talk about section A first. You can see it's perfectly horizontal, so that's like our idea of perfectly elastic. So what we're saying is that because the economy is producing so little, we're down here at Y1. So because the economy is producing so little, if I go out and try to hire some people or open an office or send an order to a factory, they're so happy to have my business or to be hired that there's no way that they're going to ask for a higher wage or raise prices. Therefore, I can produce all the way along section A, I can produce more and more and more, so increased amounts of real GDP moving to the right, without price level going up at all. In section B, as we get closer and closer to YFE, to national income at the full employment level, as we get closer and closer to that, there's more and more competition for factors of production. Therefore, we will see, as we produce more and more and more, price levels are going to go up. Section C, where it's perfectly vertical, there we're saying we're way past our, not way past, but we're past our level of national income at the full employment level. Therefore, we can't produce any more than that amount. So even if I want to or try to hire people up, the only thing that's going to happen is that price levels are going to climb. You see that that idea that we're expressing in section C is the exact same idea that Neoclassical economists express with the long-run aggregate supply curve. So it's not that their ideas are so dissimilar, it's just that the way they work and the way they're implemented are a little bit different. In the same way, the short-run aggregate supply curve is really no different than what we see along section B. It's positively sloped. As I produce more and more, price goes up and up. The distinction between these two competing schools of thought will be the topic of a lot of what we say over the next few weeks. So it's really important that you keep in mind how these two models are structured.